President's house in Washington, D.C., and it is good to see our friends from Massachusetts here to greet us. And as you might imagine, I hold a little bit of disappointment and rancor towards this past election of 1800. But Mrs. Adams has outdone herself, of course, because she has expanded our beautiful home, Peacefield. And it was to be a present, was it not, Mrs. Adams?
As to be a bit of a surprise, but
Indeed.
The surprise was ruined by a well-meaning friend who let it slip to John. So I'm glad to know that the expansion has suited your tastes, and
Indeed.
hopefully we shall have a pleasant and happy retirement away from public life.
Indeed, and more room for more books as well. Now, I could go on a great deal about the election of 1800,
And
but
he does.
bitterness does not become me always. But I will tell you this, that I am proud of what my administration accomplished, and with my finest counsel by my side, which does not include the advisors I inherited from Mr. Washington by the names of Mr. Walcott, Mr. McHenry, and of course Mr. Timothy Pickering, most particularly. And of course they were all being led by that little man from New York, perhaps. Who knows what I am speaking of when I say that little man from New York? The former Secretary of the Treasury. Any guesses?
A man with evil in his eyes.
Yes, sir. Yes, indeed.
A true Cassius. You can never trust him.
Indeed. Well, our administration had managed to avoid war against the French with some difficulties, attempts at bribery of the men that we sent there to negotiate with the government, seizing of American ships by the French Navy, their unhappiness with the treaty President Washington's administration had signed, courtesy of John Jay, the buildup of the Navy. I do go on about the Navy, do I not, Mrs. Adams?
It is one of your most prided accomplishments. A Navy is truly valuable to a country. Not so much an army, but a Navy.
Indeed. Well, and therein lies the difficulty with that man Hamilton, is I believed in a strong Navy in those times, and I still do, wooden walls, yet he had his eyes on being in command of a large army with General Washington in retirement, and was most disappointed when it was decided that there would indeed be peace with France. Unfortunately, those negotiations and the agreement of peace did not come in time to save me in the election. Did you know that Mr. Hamilton arranged for it, that New York would vote against me? And he spoke against me during the times before the election, thus making me a one-term president, despite the fact that I wished to be bipartisan. Upon taking office, and of course, my inauguration address, I was standing next to two much taller men, outgoing President Washington, and incoming Vice President Mr. Jefferson, who was no friend either. And I had reached out to Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison to go treat with France, but they would not do so. And, of course, they were the ones who castigated me for the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were protections against French nationals who had come during the time of the Revolution and during the revolutions in the tropics, and were creating great difficulties for my administration. And, of course, I could go on about the press.
Yes, I could go on about the press as well.
Indeed.
They
wrote scandalous things about me, Mr. Bache and his Aurora. And in the end, to make a long story short, I was destined to be a one-term president and come home to retirement. Now, my dear, you have some thoughts on Mr. Jefferson. You've already made your thoughts on Mr. Hamilton quite clear.
Jefferson is a complicated one of the finest men created by nature, a true, astounding mind, and we did hold ourselves quite dearly esteemed in each other's hearts. We met in France and enjoyed European culture together, wrote to each other for years, but he has proven himself quite false to you.
Indeed.
Mr. Jefferson has been behind the most slanderous writings against my husband in all of the presses. He has been feeding and paying James Callender, one of the most wicked men to ever own a printing press. Falsities, lies, speculation, and all of these have undone the honor of my good husband and my good man who has done more than anyone to serve this nation. And thus I cannot quite reconcile myself with the transgressions of Mr. Jefferson. I don't think I shall ever hold him quite as dearly in my heart as I did those years back in Paris.
Now, I'm sure someone in this audience is wondering about Mr. Jefferson's inauguration day and my not being present. Now, you might think there was ill will, and there is, but to put it rather simply, the last stage left the president's house before his inauguration. What was I to do? And I wish to return home.
And home is where we are most content, even in the years of your vice presidency, your presidency. Home in Quincy is where we've always wanted to be.
Family and friends, indeed.
Yes.
I wish to be home, and many times when I was away from Mrs. Adams and our children, I would write letters to her, not to get too personal, is not polite.
None should know the contents of our letters.
Indeed.
No, these are personal matters.
Indeed. I wrote of wishing to be home, wishing to be with my dear wife, with my children, on my farm, and with my books. Now, books. Books are a fine topic. Many of you seem to be off from school today. Is that so? Indeed.
You're good. Have you at least taken home studies to work on while you're away from your lessons? All right, good.
One, yes.
We've got one at least
Splendid.
who is not taking this as a day of leisure. You
Indeed.
should keep yourselves to your education and your studies. It is the only way to make good use of yourselves in this life.
Indeed. Well spoken, Mrs. Adams. Now, I must confess, and you may find this shocking, knowing that I am quite a collector of books now and very much about education with documents I have written, is that as a young lad growing up in Braintree, I did not care for books. Can you imagine such a thing? I loved to be outdoors, hunting, skating in the wintertime, swimming in the summer, playing games with the other boys, frolicking outside. But I was the oldest of three boys, and Father was not pleased. He had destined his oldest boy to get an education. And he asked me why I was so inattentive to my books. And being a bit impertinent, which I hope you are not, I told him I wished to be a farmer. Wish to be a farmer, he said. I shall show you what it is to be a farmer. And he took me down to the creek bed to gather thatch, and it was very arduous work. And at the end of the evening, he had thought that perhaps he had broken me. And so when he asked how I liked being a farmer, I could not help myself. I told him I like it very well, sir. And he did not like it, he told me, so you shall return to school. Well, in the end, the decision was made to go back to school, and it ended up that I was not against education and books and schooling, but I did not like my teacher, Mr. Cleverly. So Father moved me to another school headed by Mr. Marsh, who prepared me for Harvard College. Any other Harvard graduates here? There is one. Splendid. Well, I believe I graduated a bit earlier than you, sir. And though I did finish third academically, due to social standing, I finished in the middle. The food was rather wretched, although they did have salted cod on Saturdays. And then I went off to become a teacher and decide eventually to become a lawyer. But of course, Mrs. Adams, you were very well educated as well.
Yes, though not quite exactly the same sort of education as you. I do love books and reading myself, and I received a less formal education by my mother and my father in our home in Weymouth. I was taught to read and also domestic arts, how to keep a house, how to balance a budget, how to...
You do very well.
Thank you. It has been quite necessary.
Indeed. Well, when we were away in France, we, unlike Mr. Jefferson, accounted for everything that we bought. But then, remember, I was away so much of the time in those days that Mrs. Adams was the one who was running the farm and
Yes.
doing it, friends would tell me, far better than I, perhaps.
Well, thank you very much. And I was diligent with my studies, and there was a joy that I found in reading, particularly poetry, the classics. I loved to read Shakespeare, Milton, and Pope. One of the people who exposed me to such wonderful works of literature was a very dear friend who we are honored now to hold as a brother to us, Mr. Richard Cranch. Mr. Cranch is, in fact, the man who introduced John to me and to my family. Though, like you disliked books as a young man, he had rather negative opinions of me when we first met as well. A strong personality in a family of wise and serious people, myself being the middle of 3 sisters. I think you might have been a bit intimidated.
Indeed, but I did come around.
Yes, of
I did
course you
indeed.
did, John. As the years went by, we were able to connect with each other on a more intimate level, to speak of our hopes and our dreams, of the ways we might employ ourselves in the best use of our native country of Massachusetts. Both of us are very dearly in love with this Commonwealth.
Indeed.
And, well, luckily Richard Cranch did introduce us, and he eventually married my older sister, Mary, and thus I am able to call him dear brother-in-law as well.
Imagine. Jeremiah Gridley, who allowed me to pass the bar, had one of his pieces of advice was not to marry too soon. And I'm very glad that from that time when I passed the bar, not that long ago, 1759, until we married in October of 1764, it was not that long of a passing. So I did not heed his advice because I believed it was the right thing to do, and I could not have made a better choice for a wife.
I could not disagree with you, John.
I would be lost without her. In fact, I wrote many a letter when I was in Philadelphia, when I was in Europe.
Even in the early days, when you were riding the circuit.
When I was riding the circuit.
In our early years of our marriage, I started to raise first our eldest daughter, Abigail, Nabby, as we love to call her, and then our youngest son, John Quincy. And meanwhile, John was out roaming around Massachusetts trying to fix everything and being a good lawyer to the people who needed him. But it meant that he was so far away from me the entire time. My heart longs. I am broken whenever you are away. It is terribly difficult to be apart. And so anytime he did return to me, I was quite grateful. But you do need to make the money being a lawyer after all.
Indeed, but I will tell you, lawyers, we as a breed tend to talk too much, especially if there is a whole room full of us, or if we are sharing a coach or lodgings, we tend to go on a bit, and we do make poor company if you like peaceful silence. And of course, I was seeing all sorts of cases, everything from murders to piracy to my first case, which I lost, Lambert versus Field, in which I defended Mr. Field because Mr. Lambert's horse had trampled his crops, and because I wrote a writ poorly, just to become a lawyer, you see, this was back home in Braintree, the case was dismissed, and I was embarrassed, but I can assure you, I never miswrote a writ again.
No. And being around these lawyers, these scholarly men, of course, you were privy to some slightly rebellious talk fairly early on, and people's opinions began to change based on, well, the laws of Massachusetts and how the laws of England slightly affected them, and then in more greater way affected them as time went by.
In fact, the direct taxation from Parliament, which violates our Charter and the British Constitution and the rights of men, and I suppose you should add women, should you not?
I will always add the rights of women.
Indeed. Yes, and you will have the last word.
I guess I will.
Well, and perhaps you have read one of my works from those days, the dissertation on the canon and feudal law. Show of hands, who has read it? Oh dear. Well, thankfully somebody read it. And it was comparing our situation in those days with the lack of representation and the unfair taxation, the loss of our self-representative government, to the Middle Ages in those days of the feudal system. And I was told by some that it was a rather brilliant work. And I was becoming immersed in this movement that led towards rebellion before our war for independence, with some prodding from my second cousin, Samuel Adams, perhaps you have heard of him, and others. But I was very much about nonviolence. It was about ideas and the law, not about tarring and feathering and destroying homes and private property and all of that. And because of such instances, it led to the sending of troops to Boston, which you may recall. And of course, in those days, we had moved the family to Boston, seeking the practice. And you may be asking yourselves, on that night of March 5th, the event called, anyone know what that event was called, of 1770? By my second cousin and others? The massacre on King Street, in which 5 citizens of this town, 3 were killed instantly and 2 later from their wounds by the soldiers who were defending themselves. There is someone in this audience who wishes to know, why, Mr. Adams? Why did you defend those soldiers? Because, like every other person, they have the right to good counsel in a trial of their peers. If we are not about fair trials here in those days as colonies, then what are we about? We must prove to those in England that our courts exist for a reason here. That is why for 18 guineas I defended successfully those soldiers in the 2 trials. The one for Captain Preston and the one for the rest of the soldiers, in which 2, who testimony had shown, had indeed fired into the crowd that night and killed men of the town. They were found guilty of manslaughter, but they were only branded on the thumbs rather than being hanged, as the law could have provided. I felt it, and still feel, one of my greatest services. Yet I feared for my family. I feared for Mrs. Adams and the children in those days. Boston was could be a violent place.
And you, having defended British soldiers, were, while respected, not held as closely in people's hearts for that period of time. And there was some bitterness that John would defend the soldiers, and thus be seen by some as defending taxation by the English crown and defending the limitation of rights of those in Massachusetts, defending the presence of the soldiers. But I am quite proud of you that you separated those issues. While they do seem quite tied together, you focused on the events of that night, the testimony involved, and while it could not be proved that these men fired willingly into the crowd with the order to do so, you did a very good job, John. I am quite proud of you.
Thank you, my dear. And of course, as I told the jury in my closing arguments, much of what Mrs. Adams said, and that facts are stubborn things. We could not bring into question, as I said in my opening, that why these soldiers were here, but as Mrs. Adams said, by the testimony in court. But of course, events would take off after that. There would be a small period of calm, and then it was decided in London that judges would be paid by the crown and not by the people of this colony. An outrage. And then, of course, there was the business of the tea. A monopoly, an ugly monopoly, and nothing more. And though I was not there that evening, I applauded the efforts because we offered to send the tea back. Governor Hutchinson would not have it. Customs would not have it. And the tea had to go somewhere. So, of course, we found a place for it, my dear comrades who were there that night, who are anonymous.
Yes, of course. Now, I believe you referred to that evening as an epocha in history.
Indeed.
Something changed the tide of history from that moment on, and indeed that did come to pass. In response for the destruction of the tea, the Crown sent even more troops. Boston's port was closed, the local economy was brought to a standstill, soldiers patrolled the area, and unfortunately, in April of 1775, the first shots were fired of the Revolutionary War. You were not even present in Massachusetts at that point, were you, John?
I was at Congress. There had been a first Congress the previous year of 1774, and of course, we had met each other. I met men such as George Washington and Patrick Henry of Virginia, and James Duane of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. We passed a non-importation agreement, agreed that we would, of course, be treated as equal men under English law, and women. And then I returned home to Lexington and Concord. And then when I was away for the second Congress, Mrs. Adams sent me correspondence of a terrible day in June of 1775 about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the loss of our dear friend, Dr. Warren.
It was a true loss for the people of this country that day. In fact, my son, John Quincy, and I were able to watch the fires burning Charleston to the ground across the bay, and to receive the word that our dear friend, a man who had so much intelligence and passion for the cause of the American people, had been brought down because he was showing an example to the soldiers who fought alongside him. It was devastating to have to write those words to you.
And then, upon my return to the Congress, what did I hear? More pleas for moderation, an olive branch petition, and I knew then that it was too late for that. On my return in winter, before the warmer seasons of 1776, I had written in a journal 3 things of other things that needed to be accomplished. We needed to form a government. We needed to form alliances with countries such as France, and we needed to declare our independence. And even before those heady days of July, I received a letter or two from Mrs. Adams about what we should be about in that Congress, which might be of interest to all of you in this gathering. Mrs. Adams.
Of course, I wrote to you, John, that I long for you to declare an independency, and, by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I would desire that you remember the ladies and be more generous to us than your ancestors. Put not so much power into the hands of the husbands, for remember that all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, then we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves accountable to any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
Indeed. Ladies, are you in agreement? I suspect you are. Now, I wrote, dare I call it, a light-hearted letter back in return. As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Oh dear. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere. Depend upon it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. We have only the name of masters. And rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. Of course, not being home, I could not see her reaction when she received that letter.
Have you ever read something written down and perceived a certain tone to it that maybe wasn't intended by the writer? Well, my response to John was perhaps a bit more firm than his lighthearted response to my original letter. I cannot say I think you very generous to the ladies, For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, still you insist upon retaining absolute authority over wives. But you must remember, arbitrary power is, like most things which are very difficult, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our authority not only to subdue our masters, but to overcome them and free ourselves.
An ominous threat indeed, which I heeded. And of course, perhaps so did Congress in Philadelphia, because after one last effort by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, the leader of the moderates, he compared independence as crossing through a storm in a skiff made of paper, and that we might very well fail. Of course, I had to respond to him, which I did, and it was for 2 hours because I had to repeat it, and I suspect none of you want to hear me speak for 2 hours, so I will not do that. I spoke of what an opportunity we had as 13 colonies to create our government. And finally, except that New York temporarily abstained, we all voted for independence and they would follow. And it was a great day indeed, though I did get the date wrong, did I not, in my letter to you about that we will celebrate July 2nd.
Well, it is not you, John, who has it wrong, but rather the rest of history.
Indeed.
The second being the day on which it was put forward, the motion moved, and the fourth, a few days later, somewhat inconsequentially, the day the Declaration was signed. But
And passages debated, but it was done. And as one of the delegates said, it is done and I abide by it. And then, of course, I was eventually to find out as the war dragged on that I was to go to Europe in February. And of course, I was embarking with John Quincy, which we had decided would be best, and you did not wish to sail.
no, I did not wish anyone to sail. I personally, if I could have kept my husband and my 10-year-old son by my side in our home, I would have. But it is necessary to make sacrifices for the greater good, and thus I bid adieu to my dear husband and to my eldest son, and prayed that the sea would carry them as safely as possible across to France.
And that boy was brilliant. Even then, he learned French on the voyage over from a French army surgeon. And of course, there was some adventure with British ships in which I actually held a musket on deck awaiting an attack which never came. And we were off the shores of France, dining and about to land, when I heard that my whole mission was unnecessary because Dr. Franklin, when he was not involved in other pursuits, managed to secure an alliance with the French government, thus making the voyage, as Mrs. Adams thought it might, dangerous and unnecessary. And I spent a year, if you can imagine, I spent a year making a nuisance of myself with the French ministers and the French government, and Dr. Franklin was constantly apologizing for, well, the fact that I was very straightforward and said what I thought, which is not their way in those fancy salons and ballrooms and dinner parties and such. But I was finally able to return home to Mrs. Adams and my children, and to help draft a constitution for Massachusetts, a commonwealth, as I styled it. And no sooner had I enjoyed the company of Mrs. Adams and the fame coming from a constitution that would be ratified, I would not be here for its ratification, for I would be once again traveling to Europe, this time not just with John Quincy, but Charles as well, who we have most recently lost, and to travel by mules across the Pyrenees from Spain to France. And of course, there was a letter to John Quincy under your hand, encouraging him to be the best that he could be. If you would not mind sharing more of our correspondence.
Well, of course, this time of separation, this second long separation across the Atlantic, was terribly painful for myself, for John, and now for two of our sons, John Quincy and Charles. But our young men were sent off with their father to expand their education. Imagine being two boys from Massachusetts, raised on a farm, and going and being able to have a European education, to expose themselves to as much as they could possibly see of the world. And I did write to John Quincy that these are the times in which a genius would wish to live. It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. Great necessities call out great virtues. When a mind is raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities which would otherwise lay dormant wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman.
Indeed, bravo. And I encourage the children as well with their educations. And in those years in France, we secured a treaty with the British government for peace, without the help of the French, mind you. Loans from the Dutch Republic, education for the boys, travel to places such as Russia for John Quincy, and eventually, after much pleading, Mrs. Adams would bravely take to a ship and join us in those wondrous years in France and Britain.
Perhaps one of the things that was most anxiety-inducing for me, even beyond saying adieu to my husband and my boys, was myself stepping on foot a ship. Great fear that the ocean would swallow me alive, that we should meet terrible storms, disease, other ships of war, though luckily at this point I had the fortune of not sailing within wartime. However, we tended to have a slightly different response to being at sea. When John and I were able to share our stories of being on the Atlantic, it turns out that both of us, while being quite miserable at first, soon found employment upon the ship, which was entirely too dirty, the sailors not obliging by any sort of hygiene, the cook not taking care of stocks, everything terribly organized, and well, both you and I had a tendency while at sea to keep house.
Indeed, and we did so. And of course, Captain Tucker of the Boston in later years would remark of how he took a liking to me. Perhaps not at first, he was not sure of me, but by the end we became fast friends and had some adventures in that first trip. The second one, of course, trip over, was a little less eventful, except for the trip over the Pyrenees. And of course, we had a bond with Mr. Jefferson in those days.
Yes.
He was very good to John Quincy, and between myself and Mr. Jefferson, we were preparing John Quincy for Harvard admittance and a future as a lawyer. And of course, he was brilliant at everything. He did struggle with his Greek translation at times, and I aided him with his mathematics, and Mr. Jefferson aided him as well, and which is why it makes what has occurred with Mr. Jefferson just so terribly sad.
That's true. So, of course,
oh, indeed, madam.
Our focuses were not only upon John Quincy's education. You had brought Charles along with you as well.
Indeed.
To show him the world and begin to expose him to everything he could see. And I luckily had the privilege of bringing my eldest daughter, my only long-living daughter, Nabby. She came with me when we went to Paris and stayed with me through London and England. If you complain of neglect in the education of sons, then what should I say with regard to that of daughters?
Indeed.
If we mean to have learned statesmen and heroes and philosophers, then we should have learned women. The world would perhaps think me foolish and accuse me of vanity, but you, I know, have a mind much too enlarged and liberal to disregard that sentiment.
Indeed. It is my finest counsel from the very beginning of our marriage to this day, and certainly through the tumultuous days of being president. Now, our time grows short with you. We must, of course, return, and I say Quincy now. And I believe that I should yield the floor, which I seldom did in Congress or as vice president or president. I'm going to give you, madam, the last word on this morning.
What a generous offer for John to cease speaking and allow the things that truly need to be said to be said.
Indeed.
Now, our years of retirement are some of the most joyful of our lives. Of course, both of us have dealt with illnesses and losses in our later years. The loss of our dear son Charles, who unfortunately went a bit wayward in his later years in life, and my darling Nabby, our darling Nabby, who unfortunately was lost to breast cancer. To lose your children, it does weigh upon one's heart and make you wonder what sort of legacy you've left to the world. Of course, I was always a proponent of education of those younger and of the new generations to bring the United States along to its great glory. John refers to me occasionally, somewhat facetiously, as a disciple of Wollstonecraft. This is a notation to Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first feminist authors, who in England in the 1790s pens A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And unfortunately, when she publishes it under her own name, it is poorly received. So she republishes under a false man's name, and then it is wildly applauded.
Indeed.
In any case, I would like to conclude by saying that it has been difficult to feel a sense of patriotism and citizenship being denied the rights of which I asked for during the Declaration of the Independence. Patriotism in the female sex is the most disinterested of virtues, interest being a repayment on your investment in this case. Excluded from offices and honors, we have no means to attach ourselves to a state or government from having held a place of eminence. Even in the freest countries, our property is subject to the control and disposal of our partners, to whom the law has given absolute authority. Denied a voice in legislation and obliged to submit to those laws which are imposed upon us, is that not sufficient to make us not caring about the public welfare? Yet, in all history and every age, they show us instances of patriotism, patriotic virtue in the female sex, which, considering our situation, equal the most heroic of those of men. Things are changing, however. I am greatly encouraged by the fact that there is, in the last several years, more dedication shown to the education of females in America, and the rising generation will be benefited by it.
Indeed. And with that, we must leave you to return to our home in Quincy, bid you adieu, learned in France, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very kindly.
Mrs. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Adams.